Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Cheeseburger Wellington. That's right, you want to make Beef Wellington for that special occasion dinner. But your wallet doesn't want to do that. Your wallet definitely thinks you should do something else. Well, this, my friends, is something else, which is going to be significantly less expensive and every bit as visually stunning as that much more extravagant version. And to get started, the first thing we'll do is cook a strip of bacon, which I always do in a dry pan set over medium heat. And yes, I cut that strip in half so it would fit a little better. And we definitely want to cook this crisp, since the last thing you want inside your puff pastry is flabby, undercooked bacon. And of course, you remember the saying, once it looks foamy, your bacon's done, homie. And right about here, my bacon was looking very crisp and fully cooked. And once it is, we'll remove that to a plate with a paper towel to drain and cool. And then what we'll do is very carefully drain the bacon fat from the pan and give the pan a quick wipe. But don't wash it, because we're going to sear our burger in this in a few minutes. And speaking of burger, what we'll need to make one cheeseburger Wellington is 8 ounces of ground beef that we formed into a patty about an inch thick. And we'll definitely want to season that generously on both sides with salt, freshly ground black pepper, and a little bit of cayenne, which I pre-mix to save time. And by the way, if you take half a pound of ground beef and shape it into a patty about an inch thick, you'll end up with something that's about 4 1/4 to 4 1/2 inches across, which is the perfect size and shape for what we're about to do. And then once that's seasoned, we'll head back to the stove where we've turned our pan back on to high heat, and we will sear this burger for just 2 minutes per side. Okay, all we're trying to do here is form a nice brown crust for color and flavor. But since this is going to bake in our pastry, we do not want this starting to cook through now. So we are only going to sear this for 2 minutes per side, at which point we'll remove that to a plate. And then we'll transfer that plate into the fridge so our meat is very, very cold when we go ahead and wrap it in our crust. And for the crust, we'll need a sheet of ready-to-use puff pastry, which I'm going to go ahead and dust with flour on both sides. And this stuff usually comes frozen, so we'll want to make sure we thaw it enough so we can roll it out a little bit. But we don't want it too thin, so I'm not going to roll this out too much. And I'd say the ideal thickness is about 1/8 of an inch. And then once our thawed frozen puff pastry's been rolled out, I'm going to go ahead and cut 2 circles, with the first one being about 1 inch or so bigger than our burger. And luckily for me, this dish I'm using as a guide is about 5 1/4 inches. And this first piece is what we'll use for the base. And we'll go ahead and transfer that onto a sheet pan while we cut our second circle, which I will also use this dish as a guide for, but I'm going to go around and cut about 1 inch away from it, since I want this second circle about 7 1/4 inches across. All right, that one's got to be bigger, since that one's going to go over the top of our burger and fixins. And no, as you can see, it definitely doesn't have to be perfectly round, but pretty close to generally being round is a good idea. And that's it, we'll place that on our sheet pan as well. And then very, very important, we're going to pop this in the freezer for about 10 minutes, or until our puff pastry is very cold and firm again, which really is a key for working with this successfully. And that's it. Once we pull our pastry out of the freezer, we'll go ahead and transfer that now very cold and stiff bottom piece of pastry onto a parchment-lined baking sheet that we're going to bake this on. And we'll pop that in the freezer so it stays nice and cold while we design the top piece. And for that, the first thing I like to do is poke a very small vent in the center. And for that, I'm just going to use this round piping tip, but you could, if you want, just cut a small hole with a knife. Just don't cut your silpat. And then once that's been accomplished, we will take the tip of a knife, and starting in the center, we will make very shallow curved cuts, like you see me doing here. Only if you want, you can do yours better, since it looks even cooler if you make the curves more severe, so you get more of a spiral look, and not so much like spokes on a wheel. But anyway, much more important than how much you curve these lines is the fact that you do not cut all the way through. In fact, don't even cut halfway through. All right, 1/4 of the way through is perfect. That way you'll get a great design and your pastry won't split open. And that's it. Once our top piece of pastry has been vented and scored, we will pop that in the fridge, and we will grab our bottom piece out of the freezer, and we will place our burger over the top, perfectly centered, of course. And then once that's been thoughtfully placed, we'll go ahead and add our bacon to the top. And since one piece was longer than the other, I went ahead and broke some off and added it to the other side. And then once our bacon's on, we'll go ahead and top this with some cheddar cheese, which I thought might be easier to shape if I shredded it. But in hindsight, next time I'll probably just slice it thin and lay slices over. so I don't have to mess around rounding up rogue pieces. And yes, this would be the perfect time to admit this was an experiment, so I was kind of figuring this out as I went along. But anyway, that's what we call in the business the learning process. And obviously, go ahead and use any cheese you want. And a half ounce of any melty cheese will work. As well as, if you're a fan of it, blue cheese would also be fantastic in this. And then once that's been cheesed, we'll go ahead and brush an egg wash on our pastry. And once that's been accomplished, we will grab our top crust out of the fridge, and we will warm it up in our hands until it's nice and flexible. And we will center that over the top and gently press it down. And while it's still a little bit firm, we can kind of get it in the right position. But as it warms up and softens, we're actually going to want to kind of push and smear that top crust into that bottom piece of pastry. Okay, so we'll go all the way around doing just that. And then to hedge our bets, I like to kind of push and roll that bottom crust up over the top a little bit like this. Just going around kind of forming a nice tight seam. And because we used an egg wash, and we pressed those two pieces of dough together pretty well, by the time we have this outside edge rolled up nice and tight, we're going to have a seal that should not leak in the oven. Or at least that's the plan. Plus, as you'll see in a few minutes, we're actually going to give this edge one more press with a fork before it goes in the oven. But I really want to do that when the pastry is nice and cold. And the same thing goes for baking this. So what we'll do when we get it to this stage is just pop it in the fridge until we're ready to bake. And yes, this part can be done hours ahead of time, as long as you keep everything nice and cold. And that's it. Once we're ready to bake, we'll go ahead and pull that out of the fridge, and we'll preheat our oven to 450. And we will take a fork, and we'll go all the way around the edge, pressing it down like this. Which again is really just to make sure this is sealed, and not really for any kind of decoration. Okay, well, we're definitely going to see the lines on the top once this bakes. As you'll see, we're not really going to be able to notice anything we did around the bottom edge. And that's it. Once that's been all forked up, we'll go ahead and brush our egg wash over the entire surface. And in case you're new around here, an egg wash is simply an egg beaten with a teaspoon of water, which we brush on baked goods to give them an even more beautiful brown finish. And that's it. Our bacon cheeseburger Wellington is ready to transfer into the center of a 450-degree oven for 22 minutes, or until it looks like this, which I think is just absolutely stunning. And I know it looks like we have a cheese nipple, but relax, it's actually a cheese navel. Since everything's going to kind of settle and contract as this cools, which we want to let this do for at least 5 or 6 minutes before we serve it. So I'm going to go ahead and carefully transfer this onto a cooling rack, where, like I said, I'm going to let it rest for a little bit. And I think this would be the perfect time for a little reminder that you can make this. Yes, you. Right, this is something that looks so much harder to do than it actually is. Although please, on behalf of everyone in the business, do not give away our secret. Artificially, this is complex and takes a lot of effort. And that's it. After the looking and the resting, we'll go ahead and transfer that onto a plate. And I'm going to take a knife and cut this right in half so we can see how we did. Oh, and bad news if you want this rare or very medium rare, since we must leave this in the oven long enough for that puff pastry to cook. But if everything goes according to plan, we should still have some nice pinkness inside, which I did. And for an experiment done with minimal testing, I was absolutely thrilled with how this came out. So I went ahead and served up half. Next is some roasted Brussels sprouts, on top of our famous Food Wishes mushroom sauce. But anyway, I served that up, and I took some contractually obligated pictures, which will explain the appearance of that extra piece of mushroom, placed there for food styling purposes. And then I grabbed a fork and knife and dug in to what I thought looked, felt, and tasted exactly like a bacon cheeseburger Wellington. All right, I'm not going to waste a lot of time explaining what a bacon cheeseburger tastes like, since most of you know. But I will say all those flavors work really well encased in a buttery, crispy puff pastry shell. Which reminds me, if you don't want to use a fork and knife for this, I'd have no problem with you picking it up with your hands and eating it like some glorious savage. And in that case, you'd have to dip it in the gravy. But since we're positioning this as a budget-friendly, inflation-fighting alternative to a Beef Wellington, I decided to go with the more formal plating. And yes, I think half of one of these is a perfect size portion, since it is very rich, especially with the mushroom sauce. So not only is this way less expensive, because we're using ground beef instead of beef tenderloin, but we're only given 4 ounces per serving. So while it definitely doesn't look like it, this really is an extremely frugal recipe. And yes, obviously this would work with different kinds of ground meat, like lamb or veal or pork sausage or turkey. Okay, that really doesn't matter, since the technique will work just the same. So feel free to adapt this to your tastes. I mean, you guys are, after all, the Food Wishes alum of your Cheeseburger Wellington. Oh, and before I finish up here, because the food nerds are going crazy right now, I should mention I called this a Wellington because most people know what that is. But culinarily speaking, what this really is something called a petit. So if you were already writing that comment or email to me, just go ahead and stop. But anyway, whether you call it a Wellington or not, this features all the fancy with only a little bit of the fuss. And whether you serve it for some fancy occasion or not, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.